aesthetics of music. I have written a fair amount on the philosophy of music, about free songs, about multimodal aspects of musical listening, about profundity in music and so on, but I have not, and I have this project about global aesthetics, which you're going to hear all about, but in some ways what I'm trying to do here is not telling you what the global aesthetic of music is, but asking you to help me figure out how to extend my account, which is very visual-centric, to music. So it's more information flow in this direction. Sorry that I'm abusing the role of the speaker. So the general idea behind this project, my project of global aesthetics, is to try to not think of aesthetics as a kind of a generally, as a Western discipline, as something that privileges the West, but it's not a very easy thing to do, and what I'm going to try to argue today is that there's these two conflicting imperatives when we're trying to extend aesthetics to the global scale, and one of them is kind of is pushing you in an anti-universalist direction. So the idea is that we can't just kind of read off how people from other parts of the planet would react to a certain musical piece or a certain visual artwork just from the way how we are reacting to it. And the reason for that is mainly empirical. It has a lot to do with how perception depends very heavily on various background mental processes. But if that's all we had, then what we would end up with is some kind of a fragmented aesthetic world where you have completely different Western aesthetics, completely different Japanese aesthetics, completely different, I don't know, Southeast Tanzanian aesthetics. And that is not really feasible, partly because of the cultural exchanges between these areas. So what we also need, in addition to this kind of anti-universalist push, is a universalist pushback, whereby we can provide some kind of a non-Western inspired framework that allow us to talk about all kinds of artworks, all kinds of musical pieces, all kinds of paintings, all kinds of works of artistic production in the same kind of framework. And that's the only way we can really talk about cross-cultural interactions. So you have this kind of trade-off between the universalist and the anti-universalist imperatives. So and it seems like one endpoint, what we want to avoid is fragmentation. So when because of like a complete anti-universalism, we have this we have a separate discipline about classical Chinese opera that has no way of communicating with the discourse about Western classical music, that has no way of communicating with Javanese music and so on. So that's one endpoint which we want to avoid. And the other endpoint we want to avoid is some form of colonialism, where all we do is to just somehow extend our Western way of looking at objects or listening to music in a way that would apply to everything else. So that's the kind of delicate balance that we have to keep. And again, this is false advertisement. I'm not going to tell you how this is going to work for music. There are some things that I know about especially about the literature on tonality, where there is a similar kind of duality between universalism and anti-universalism. So there are some findings about tonality, that it's not the case that all cultures have the same attitudes towards tonality as the Western. There's an interesting findings on the Chimane people who seem to have no preference to tonality over atonal music, so sometimes the same kind of preference. On the other hand, there are some kind of universalist directions in the research, and there's this interesting study about Mar and colleagues about how healing songs tend to have very different kind of structure from love songs. So healing songs have much less notes per second, whereas love songs have more, and healing songs tend to have them kind of close together in the tonal space, whereas love songs have more further away, so there's more jumps in love songs. And that seems to be somehow universally true. Again, I'm not an expert on this, and I would love to hear if you have more, have any kind of input on how to extend it. So again, this is going to be mainly about the visual sense modality. And this is about what I'm going to do, and I have written a bit about global aesthetics in this aesthetics version introduction. And there's also another book that was just published last week, in fact. It's called the Geography of Taste, which I co-wrote with Dom Lopez, Mohan Methan, and Samantha Methan. They're all philosophers. And where we talk a fair amount about musical examples. And again, there's the question is how aesthetics should be changed in the light of just the extreme cross-cultural variations in reaction to various pieces of art. So that was just published by Oxford University Press last week, so I don't even have the picture up there. And yeah, I'm supposed to be writing this book called Global Aesthetics. It was due 2 years ago, but I'm going to get there at some point if you guys help me. All right, so, and what I'm going to talk about, so this is what we need for global aesthetics. I already kind of said this. The anti-universalist desideratum, so that art is perceived differently in different cultures, and I'm going to argue for this. This is going to be the mainly empirical bit. Anti-privileged access, which is kind of an extension of this. We have much more information about certain cultures than about other cultures, and part of the reason for that is just complete coincidence. In the West, we tend to write things down, and we tend to keep them in libraries, and the libraries tend to not burn down. So we have a lot of information about the history of Western art. We have much less information about the history of all kinds of other arts. And that should not be, this kind of epistemic asymmetry, which is a complete contingent historical fact, should not be the basis of some kind of a value bias. And then the last thing, which I kind of care the most about, which I take to be the most novel part of this project, is to come up with some kind of a non-Western conceptual framework that would nonetheless apply to all kinds of art production, regardless of where and when it happened. And I should say something about, so Nanette said that I'm a philosopher. I'm a philosopher. I also, as you can see, I'm doing aesthetics, but I also, what I do most of the time is some form of kind of cognitive science-y stuff. So there's going to be a fair amount of empirical findings in what follows. So the first thing that I want to do is to argue that you can't just generalize from our Western perspective to the rest of the world, and the reason for that is top-down influences on perception. So if you're listening to a musical piece, and I'm listening to a musical piece, we're listening to the same input, but our experience might be very, very different. And the reason for that is empirical, and I'm going to just kind of walk you through it. And in the context of the global aesthetics, it's important because if I have a certain kind of perceptual background, perceptual history, where I was listening to a certain kind of music, and you grew up in a completely different place where you're listening to a completely different kind of music, we're going to, if we're listening to the very same musical piece, we're going to have radically different experiences. So because of this, we can't generalize from our Western experience to how other people from other parts of the world what kind of experience they're going to have. That's the general gist of the first bit. And if it's controversial, I don't think it should be controversial, but if it's controversial, it sounds controversial, it really shouldn't in the light of a wide variety of empirical findings. So, so we have a huge amount of information about the, So I'm going to get that. First, I'm just going to walk through the 3 parts. So this is going to be the first thing that I'm going to talk about. The second thing I'm going to talk about is that, is how, if it is the case, so let's just accept that what I argued in the first part is true. So we can't just generalize from our Western experience about how people in different parts of the world will listen to a certain piece of music. If that's the case, then how are we going to find out how people in the different parts of the world are listening to music? And how are we going to find out how, for example, the Maya were listening to music? And here we have this is what I already alluded to as epistemic asymmetry. And again, this is a visual example. Michael Baxandau was a very famous art historian who wrote a very famous book about painting and experience in 15th century Italy, where he consulted a lot of written sources about how people were looking at paintings in 15th century Italy. He could do this because there were a lot of written sources that were accessible to him. He could not do this with how the Incas at that same time were looking at their visual art because there are no sources. Because the Incas had very complex writing system, but they did not waste it on writing about how we look at pictures. They were writing about all kinds of other things. So if it is the case that there are these big differences between how people who grew up in different cultures are reacting to artworks, in order to understand how people who are not part of our culture react to different artworks, the big question is how we can find that out if we don't have any kind of access to written or other kind of access to direct access to that experience. And that's why we need some kind of maneuvering about coming up with some kind of a conceptual space that would allow us to describe all kinds of the experience of all kinds of musical works, regardless of where they, what kind of cultural background the person who's listening to the music has. And that's going to be the third part, where I'm doing this thing that I guess is popular these days, using big data and digital humanities stuff to try to come up with a conceptual framework that is not Western inspired, and that nonetheless allows for some kind of important information, aesthetically relevant information about artworks, regardless of where they were made. And I have that somewhat worked out for pictures and pictorial organization, but not for music. So that's why I'm here. That's what I'm trying to get out of this. And I should acknowledge that, of course, that's not going to be the whole story. The kind of information that we can get that's going to be all kind of culture independent is going to be just one part of the picture. That's not going to explain the entire experience. Some part of it is going to be all culture independent, but it could be a very important first step to understanding how people from other cultures react to artworks. And that's the only way we can somehow avoid this methodological asymmetry that I talked about in the previous unit. All right. So the first the first thing I'm going to talk about is anti-universalism. And here it's kind of an interesting or weird asymmetry between what philosophers often do and between people like between art historians and, of course, musicologists, especially ethnomusicologists, are doing. Aestheticians, kind of traditionally at least, they were always going for aesthetic universals. What is beauty, regardless of what kind of background people have. Whereas art historians were interested in cultural variations, as were musicologists, as I understand, especially ethnomusicologists. And a lot of art historians, not so sure about musicologists, they accused aestheticians of being too interested in cultural universals, and that accusation is often actually quite valid, in the sense that, and especially if you consider kind of more recent empirical aesthetics, so people like Ramachandran and Zeki, they really actively disregard the cultural background of the subjects that they're working with and try to look for some kind of cultural universals in their reaction to, let's say, listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. What I'm going to argue is that if you take the empirical sciences seriously, then what you have to expect is the exact opposite. Is not that we should look for aesthetic universals, but that there can't really be aesthetic universals. And the reason for that is because we have an extreme amount of evidence for top-down influences on perception. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not going to talk about perceptual learning and active nature aesthetic experience today. So here's the quality of the slides improves significantly. This is from a neuroscientist co-author of mine. They make prettier slides than philosophers, apparently. So you might think that perception is a kind of a bottom-up one-way street, but it's not. So this is vision, I'm afraid. And the way it works is that the light hits the retina, and then the first stop of visual processing is supposed to be the LGN, and then the prime visual cortex, secondary visual cortex, V4, IT, and so on. But we have a lot of evidence that it's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street, There's a lot of information flow coming the other direction. So we know a lot about the prime visual cortex. For accidental reasons, it's easy to study because it's close to the skull, and it has a retinotopic structure, which just means that it's kind of exactly mirrors the structure of the retina in terms of its spatial structure. And there was this big finding that 94% of the input to the prime visual cortex does not come from the retina. It comes laterally or from top-down sources. So there's a lot of information that's coming not from the bottom up, but from top down at all stages of visual processing. And I'm going to probably, maybe not skip that. So if that's true, then if it is the case that our perceptual processing depends heavily on what kind of higher level mental states we have, then if people have very different kinds of higher level mental states, they're going to have very different kind of perceptual processing. And people in different kinds of cultures, they will have different kind of higher level mental states, partly because they're exposed to different kind of stimuli throughout their lives. That's the importance of the perceptual history. So perceptual history is very important. What you perceive now is very heavily dependent on things that you have perceived before. If you have perceived a certain kind of music in your lifetime, and only that kind of music, you're going to perceive something very differently from the way if you had completely different kinds of music in your perceptual history. So this means that your perceptual experience is what you perceive, how you perceive, is going to be dependent on things that are in your mind other than your perceptual states. And that also means that, and this is kind of going back to a very big and influential idea from the art historian Henrik Wölfflin about the history of vision. He argued that it's the main aim of art history is to explore the history of vision. And I'm not sure that there were musicologists who were making similar claims, but you could make a similar claim that really part of what's important about understanding music, about the aesthetics of music, is to understand how listening were different in different kind of historical eras. And there's been a lot of debates about this history of vision claims, but in certain sense it must be true. It must be true because people in different points in history had very different kind of higher level mental states, very different kind of beliefs, very different kind of pieces of knowledge, very different kind of perceptual histories. And given that perception depends on all of these things, the perception itself must have been also different. But if history, and this is where you can go global, if vision has a history, then vision also has a geography. So in the same way, if music has a history, then music also has a geography. So given that there are differences in the higher order mental states of people who grew up in different parts of the world, there will be differences in the way people perceive depending on where they grew up. And I want to talk a little bit about how these top-down influences work. It sounds a little abstract and a little kind of neuro. So I want to fill in the details, and I want to talk about two processes that mediate in these kind of top-down influences on perception. That is the main reason why there are these cross-cultural variations in perception. And there's going to be attention and mental imagery, and the general structure of the argument is that there are going to be top-down influences on attention, top-down influences on mental imagery, and our experiences depend heavily both on attention and on mental imagery, and our experiences of artworks, of music, and of visual arts also depend on attention and mental imagery. So global aesthetics needs to pay really significant attention to cross-cultural variations, both in attention and in mental imagery. So attention first. Do you remember this? It was when the World Cup was in Brazil. It was the logo. It's pretty weird. It was supposed to be the Brazilian national colors, and I think the shape is supposed to be the World Cup trophy, and hands coming together. But if you see face palm, then it's very difficult not to see it again. So what's happening here is that you attend differently. So there's a kind of a before-after thing. Before I told you about the face palm, you were attending very differently from the way you did afterwards. And that made a huge aesthetic difference, probably a negative one. But it can also make a positive difference. So this is a painting by Paul Klee, and I didn't tell you about the title. The title is Green X Above Left, and I talk about this in my book, Aesthetics as Philosophy of Perception. If you look at it again, it's a very different experience. Maybe beforehand, you probably didn't see the green X on left beforehand. Any one of you did? Oh, come on. It's supposed to be all like all about music, not about vision. But maybe beforehand you didn't, and then the whole thing didn't somehow hold together, but when you saw the X, it looks more composed or more balanced. So it can make a positive difference as well, the changes in attention. It can also make a significantly bad negative attention. So how many of you have seen the film Goldfinger, the third Bond film? How many of you have seen it relatively recently? If you had, then you would have noticed this similarity, which when I saw it recently did not improve my experience. This is a little medallion from the Solomon Islands, and this is a kind of a global example. If you're looking at it without me telling you anything about it, you probably see a nice abstract pattern, is that right? But if I tell you that this is, first of all, in the Solomon Islands, it's a tiny island, and basically the only thing that they can eat is fish. And in this medallion, what you have is the depiction of fishes, I can really point as far. Those are little kind of dolphin-shaped fishes with a hump there. And this is a frigate bird, which is very important for them because the frigate bird eats fish, and where the frigate birds are, that's where the fishes are. So now that I told you this, you're going to have a very different kind of experience. And your experience now is going to be more like the experience of the people whose aesthetic experience we're trying to understand, the people in the Solomon Islands. So you can see the cultural difference here between your Western perspective when you saw this as an abstract shape, and the Solomon Island perspective when you saw it as a frigate bird and fishes. So I talked about what you're attending to and how the difference is about how what you're attending to makes a difference, but it also makes a huge difference how you're attending to things. And here is a very somewhat famous study about eye movements from Norway, I think. Somewhere in Scandinavia. I think it's a Norwegian group that did this study. And that's there's a difference between people who are novices and art experts, or people who had some kind of art school experience. So if you're a novice, your eye movements are going to focus on the focal objects. If you have some kind of art school training, then it's more distributed. And it's going to be a very different kind of experience. There's a lot more footnotes here. Eye movement is not the same thing as attention, of course, but at least it's indicative of how differences in how you're attending, whether you're attending in a distributed or focused manner, is going to make an aesthetic difference. And I'm going to talk a little bit about mental imagery. So that was attention. So the idea is that attention is one of the mediators of the top-down influences on perception, because attention depends very heavily on what kind of background states you have, and attention itself makes a big aesthetic difference about how you're going to experience something aesthetically. The other big mediator is mental imagery. So I published this book last year, Mental Imagery, and the longest chapter there is about mental imagery in art, where I talk a fair amount about musical examples as well. But maybe it's easier to explain with visual examples, the importance of mental imagery in aesthetic appreciation. So this is the first shot of the Buster Keaton short called Cops. So you go to the theater, you know that the title of the film is Cops, and this is the first image you see. You're going to fill out the parts of what's behind what's outside the frame accordingly, depending on how your expectations and depending on your background knowledge, namely as a prison cell, right? But then, as it turns out, that's the visual joke, that he's not in prison. He is just behind a iron gate, and reason why he's so sad is not because he's in jail, but because that's the kind of face he has. Maybe I'm gonna skip through these and go for some more global examples. So this is a famous Thai film director who won the Cannes Golden Palm a couple of years ago, and whose films are very heavily dependent on mental imagery when we have no idea how to fill in what's in that tent, what's behind the foliages of the jungle, and that gives a very important eerie feeling to the films that it's probably much more pronounced if you grew up in Thailand, in rural Thailand, than if you grew up in Oslo, where forests have a very different kind of danger level, I guess. And here's maybe an even more impressive example. This is a contemporary Indonesian artist who, and it's pretty easy to see what kind of mental imagery you're supposed to have here. Horses, and that's, the way we fill that in visually with horses is going to be culturally universal. What is not culturally universal is the way horses are perceived in the two different cultures. So in the West, I'm sure that it brings to mind cute scenes of pony rides as a child or something like that, visit to farms, all nice and fuzzy feelings. If you grew up in Indonesia, horses have the very strong connotation of military oppression, because the only people who had horses were the Dutch soldiers. So you can see how, depending on where you grew up, the mental imagery that you form is going to be very differently emotionally colored. And that's going to make a huge difference in your aesthetic appreciation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about expectations, partly because of the musical thing. So you have one of the things that artworks do a lot is to play with expectations. There's a lot of Buster Keaton in this talk for some reason. So and also to go against expectations and to go a little less highbrow. This is from the 80s film Top Secret that has a lot of visual jokes like this or like this, where there's an expectation that you have and they go straight against the expectation. That's also a form of mental imagery. In my account, I don't really need to rely on this. What I want to really talk about, the reason why I'm talking about expectations is to talk a little bit about musical expectations, which I do take to be a form of temporal mental imagery. And I'd be happy to talk about this at the Q&A about what form of mental imagery it is or how to think about that. But when you hear the first three notes of the ta-ta-ta-tam, then after the third note, you have this temporal mental imagery of the fourth note that can be quite strong in the sense that you actually hear it in your mind's ear. But even if you don't, it is there. And if you hear a different tone that's not what you expected, then you have this kind of striking, jarring feeling. And I just want to mention this real-life example because the ta-ta-ta-tam is clearly a kind of a toy example. But there's quite an interesting contemporary art piece by Katie Peterson, who's a British artist. It's called Earth, Moon, Earth. Earth, Moon, Earth is a communication system that the military uses. The idea is that you send signals up the moon, and then it reflects back. So you can communicate from one point on Earth to the other point on Earth by this method. And what this artist did was to send the Moonshine Sonata, moon, moonshine, witty, up the moon. And then what's happening is that it's not a fully exact transmission, partly because of the craters of the moon. So there's going to be parts of the information that get lost. And so you go into this room, and there's this player piano playing the Moonshine Sonata, but some tones, the information gets lost. And if you know the Moonshine Sonata, but even if you don't, it's very striking that you hear the familiar tune, and then suddenly some parts are missing, and then your mind fills in those gaps. So that very heavily relies on mental imagery, musical mental imagery, this piece, and also how this musical mental imagery depends on your musical background. So the Top Gun mental imagery. If someone had never heard the Moonshine Sonata, their experience is going to be radically different of this piece. So again, I was trying to show you how mental imagery is, again, a mediator of the top-down influences on perception. So what follows from all this is that universalism is really not an option when it comes to to thinking about aesthetics. It's not an option to think that just because I react in a certain way to a musical piece, everyone else is going to react to that musical piece the same way. And the reasons for that are not somehow theoretical reasons, they're kind of really hard empirical reasons. I want to be a little quicker on this one, on the second part, and it's about the epistemic asymmetry. Remember, the issue here was that if it is the case that you can't use your Western-based musical experience as a kind of guidance to how people from different parts of the world have their musical experiences, then what should you use? Especially if those people are no longer with us. And the issue here is that if you take this kind of anti-universalist view that I was talking about in the previous part of the talk, and if you also accept that there's this epistemic asymmetry, which is very hard to deny, given that we have a huge amount of information about the West and very little information about any other cultures, with the possible exceptions of Japan, China, and India, then we have a certain just epistemic issue, a certain skepticism about how we can ever find out about how people listen to music, how other people's experiences of music or other kind of artworks are. So, what we need in order to get over to somehow to push past this kind of skeptical take is to have some form of way in which we can understand or conceptualize music or other kind of works of artistic production in a way that does not presuppose knowledge about the cultural context. So a big, huge push in the history of the last half century or more of aesthetics is that we should not be formalist. Formalism is the worst thing that you can be. We should always start with the social context of the work. That should be the first thing. If you do that, then if you have no information about the social context, which is the case for the vast majority of art production in the world, then you're going to be in a much less good position to start your analysis. So you're going to be in a much worse position to write a paper for a top art history journal, for example. And that's why art history journals are still full of, even in this age of allegedly global art history, they're full of social art history analyses of Western artworks, because you just have way more information about the social context. So what I want to suggest instead is to start with this kind of non-Western but universally applicable conceptual framework that actively ignores the social context so that it would not privilege the West. But I want to also really acknowledge that that's not the whole story. That's very far away from being the whole story. That is just kind of the first step that kind of bootstraps the process of trying to, on the basis of this kind of universal cultural universal feature space or conceptual framework, you then can consult what you do know about the cultural context, and you can go back and talk more about the culture-independent thing and so on. So you have this kind of multi-step model. You have universal, followed by non-universal, followed by universal, and so on. Right. And I want to, and this is where I'm going to just somehow really abandon my audience here, and instead of music, I'm going to talk about pictures. Because I have a somewhat worked out way in which you can do this, but really the aim is to try to somehow figure out how the similar kind of move could be made about music. So in order for us to put together this kind of non-Western inspired but universally applicable conceptual space, what we need to find are certain features of artworks that are there in all artworks produced in any kind of cultures, and that are also aesthetically relevant in all of these cultures. So again, I have some thoughts about what they might be in music, but you guys know much more about this, so I'll be very, very curious to know what would be the equivalent. And what I want to do is to kind of just do this for pictures. And again, that's not going to be all of visual arts, it's just pictures, by which I just mean two-dimensional depictions of three-dimensional objects or three-dimensional scenes, give or take. Maybe it doesn't have to be all two-dimensional, all three-dimensional. We can come back to that. It doesn't have to be oil on canvas or tempera on wood. It can also be ink on human skin. It can also be patterns of stones in the desert. So what we're looking for is some kind of feature that every picture has, and that's also aesthetically significant. Now there are some features that all pictures have. Here is a feature, size. Every picture has a size. The size of this big or that big. But that's not going to be aesthetically significant in all cultures. Material composition, another trivial example, and here is an even more trivial example. Whether it depicts an apple. For all pictures, there is an answer to how many apples it depicts. For most pictures, it's going to be 0. Some pictures, it's going to be 1, and so on. That's okay. So it's a feature that's there in all pictures, no matter where they were made. The problem is that they're not going to be aesthetically significant. Here is a feature it's a little less silly, and that's temporal thickness. So all pictures have a certain temporal thickness. So either it depicts just a tiny, very, very narrow slice of the depicted scene, like this one, or this one, or a much thicker slice of the depicted scene. And part of the tranquility of the Vermeers is that if the depiction happened just a split second later, you would have the exact same picture, which is not the case here. So again, the problem here is that that's going to be aesthetically significant in many cases, but I don't think that we can really say that it's going to be aesthetically significant in all cases. But I want to say that there are features that will be aesthetically significant in all cases, and I want to say that that's going to be pictorial organization. And that's about how a three-dimensional scene is rendered in 2 dimensions. So, but it's going to take some time to get there. By the way, can you give me some signs about how am I with time? So maybe like 20 minutes before the end or 10 minutes before the end. Okay. So yeah, so I want to talk about a couple of features that are going to be things that any kind of picture maker, no matter where you are, you have to think about it. You have to make a decision whether you do this or whether you do that. One of them is color constancy. So color constancy is this famous phenomenon known for psychologists and philosophers, I guess, that same color can look very different, and different colors can look the very same. So A and B, it's actually the same color. I hope I have the reveal. Yeah. So when you're doing depiction, you either respect color constancy or not. You have to make a decision. So these are two paintings that were made about the same time. One of them, this one, they really pay attention to pay their due to color constancies, and that one is not. So this is a decision that you have to make. So the natural world, if I just look around, there will be color constancies. Do I want to reproduce that in my paintings or not? This guy wanted to reproduce it. That guy didn't. Size constancy, that's a similar phenomenon. So the idea is that depending on how far away things are, they take up different size of your retina. Nonetheless, they somehow appear the same size. Again, some paintings, some pictures, they respect that. Some pictures don't. Whoever did this, was very much interested in reproducing size constancy. Whoever did this was not interested in reproducing size constancy. You can ask this question about paintings regardless of where they were made and regardless of how much you know about the painter and their background and their name and their biography. Shape constancy is the third one. So again, this is the same shape, the same distal shape of the 3 doors, but they take up very different kind of shape. They have a very different shape on as they are projected on your retina. Again, some pictures, they very much will respect shape constancy. For example, photographs. So this one. Some paintings, they don't, like this one. Okay. So I'm obviously not the first person who talked about constancies in history of paintings, and I really want to emphasize that I don't want to go along with people who, like Gombrich, who are very actively thought of the respect for constancy as some kind of a progress in art. So the old dumb people, they did not know how to do constancy, and then the new smart people, they did. That's blatantly false empirically. The people who came up with linear perspective, for example, which is the main way of respecting size constancy, were the Chinese, like more than 2 millennia ago. And they came up with it, they didn't like it, so they abandoned it. So it's not about it's not supposed to be about progress, and that's kind of a very colonialist way of looking at it. So constancy is not better than no constancy. All I want to say is that regardless of where you're making your pictures, you're gonna choose one. Here is a fourth feature that you really have to choose how to kind of take a stand on, and that's occlusion. So occlusion is the feature when you sometimes you see an object and some of it is occluded by other objects. So some paintings, they really, really go out of their way to avoid all kinds of occlusion, like these paintings. Look at this. Look, all these little, all the figures, and I'm going to have way more pictures by this. All these figures are standing in a way that they're not occluding any of the little plants. Some other picture makers, like Vermeer, they didn't really care about or maybe they even piled on occlusion. They did not avoid occlusion. So again, that's something that no matter where you're making your picture, you have to somehow take a stand on. The other one is empty surface. So some picture makers, they seek out empty surfaces. Look at this, something like 95% of that of the surface of that image is empty. And here, there's a very conscious effort is being made to not leave any part of the surface as somehow empty. So again, that's a kind of a formal-ish feature that you have to make some kind of a decision about when you're making a picture. And the last one I want to talk about is the frame, whether you respect the frame or not. So this picture, it's composed in a way that the frame, the way the actions in the paintings are framed, they are not, everything that's pictorially significant are inside the frame and nicely delineated. Some other paintings, they're not doing that. So here you can see that the head of that girl is completely cut off. So you got this kind of properties. I talked about 20 minutes, okay. Talked about 6 properties, and you might think that this is kind of a big random properties, like I talked about constancies and occlusion, empty space, and so on. What is it that brings them together? I think that what brings them together is that all of these are very important indications of how the pictorial organization of the picture is going. And I want to make a distinction, all of these things are going to kind of fall under. And this is going to be a scene first versus surface first pictorial organization. So some pictures, they really pay attention to how pictorial elements are organized on the surface. So this is one example. This is the last scene of La Ventura. Some others, they don't. There's no attention to how pictorial elements are organized on the surface here. So I want to distinguish these 2 different forms of pictorial organizations. I talk about surface-first pictorial organization when what you're doing is you're manipulating 2-dimensional elements. You have a 2-dimensional surface, and you're placing 2-dimensional elements in that surface in some kind of way that would make an aesthetic sense. In the scene-first pictorial organization, what you're doing is you're organizing 3-dimensional elements. So you're putting down certain 3-dimensional objects, and then you choose a vantage point, and that's what's going to be the organization. Now, it's important that this is not a distinction between how you're making the picture, but a distinction about what you're supposed to be paying attention to as the observer. So in the case of this billiard thing, what you can do is that you have a rectangle, and you have circles, and you place, and what you're supposed to be paying attention is how the circles are distributed within the rectangle. That would be surface first. Scene first would be a way of putting together a picture by having the viewer pay attention to how the three-dimensional balls are organized on the table in comparison to the vantage point. Right. So this is a distinction that, interestingly enough, is much more worked out in film theory than in art history. Sergei Eisenstein, the film director, made this distinction between mise-en-scène and mise-en-cadre. The mise-en-cadre is the way you put certain two-dimensional elements within inside the frame, and mise-en-scène is when you're manipulating three-dimensional objects. Okay, so it's important that you don't have to, that it is not a distinction between how you're making the pictures. So if you're painting, just have a canvas, and what you're doing is, in fact, just filling in that rectangle with certain shapes. Nonetheless, you can do it in a way that makes the spectator of the picture pay attention to the three-dimensional objects and the way they are organized inside the three-dimensional space. And if you're making a film or doing a photograph, you can nonetheless, although what in fact happens is that you tell this actor to move a little bit further away. So what you're doing is manipulating three-dimensional objects in three-dimensional space. But what you ask the audience to pay attention to is the surface first picture organization. So is how two-dimensional elements are organized on the two-dimensional surface, as in this case in Citizen Kane. Now, one thing that I should emphasize is that this is the surface first versus scene first picture organization is something that is a choice that's there in all kinds of cultures. Why? Because in a painting, even a picture, any kind of picture, you're simultaneously aware both of the two-dimensional surface of the picture and of the depicted three-dimensional scene. And the question is, which one is going to win out in this attention? Are you going to be paying more attention to the depicted three-dimensional scene? Are you paying more attention to the two-dimensional surface? There is no way of, you have to somehow balance these two things. So wherever you make the picture, you're making it a picture in a way that the people who are going to be looking at it are going to should be attending to either the two-dimensional surface and its organization, or the three-dimensional scene and its organization. And these other features that I was talking about, they're going to kind of fall out of this dichotomy between surface first and scene first picture organization. If you're doing surface first picture organization, which remember is the one when you're somehow having these two-dimensional shapes, you're placing two-dimensional shapes in a two-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface, that's what you're supposed to be paying attention to. Then you have to pay attention to occlusion. Occlusion is a surface feature, right? You have to pay attention to the empty surface, you have to pay attention to the frame. And paying attention does not necessarily mean that you have to avoid or you have to pile it on. It can be either, but you can't just be neutral about it. And conversely, if you're doing scene-first picture organization, then that means that you're much more likely to pay attention to the color constancy, shape constancy, and size constancy, and all the perceptual constancies. So and I'm not going to talk about film. So just a couple of examples, and then so occlusion. So here's here is one example that's very blatantly are avoiding occlusions, going out of its way to look at the little flowers. Not one of them is occluded by another. Here, on the other hand, you're piling on occlusion. So excessively avoiding occlusion, excessively seeking out occlusion. All of these are supposed to be surface first picture organizational markers, because occlusion, again, is a surface first feature. It's about how one two-dimensional shape is related to another two-dimensional shape. Here again, you have the the 12 apostles plus Jesus, and they happen to not occlude. None of them includes another one that would never happen. I'm looking at, 20-something of you. Each of you are occluded by something. And there's a lot more examples that I'm just going to flip through because there's not enough time. You get the general idea. I should say that there's a little kind of more complications here about how there are variations within a certain time period by a certain painter. For example, heaven always has much less occlusion than hell. And there's also certain different themes have, so still lifes tend to have much more occlusion, especially when it comes to still lifes of food than other genres. I should also point out that, for example, Mickey Mouse, his ears is a good example for occlusion. If Mickey Mouse were a normal mouse, if it were a three-dimensional, if we were composing Mickey Mouse as a three-dimensional way, in a scene-first way, then one of his ears would occlude the other ear, but that never happens. And also, children's drawing, they famously excessively avoid all kinds of occlusion. All right. The second feature I want to talk about a little bit more details, but again, somewhat more quickly, is empty surface. So these are global examples. This is a Venezuelan photographer who clearly seeks out empty surfaces. This is a digitally manipulated photograph when you digitally remove various features in a way that makes the surface much emptier, whereas in the other painting you have an excessive avoidance of empty surface. And again, regardless of where the painting is made, you have to make some kind of a choice. Very clearly, European painting in the 15th century, they really hated empty space, and they did everything they could to avoid that. Which also, that kind of can lead to nice little nuances. Here, when you do have some kind of an empty space, that kind of draws your attention, and it draws your attention to the main action here of Jesus giving the keys to St. Peter. And you can see just how it's almost silly the way the empty surface is filled in. More examples from various things. So, and I should say that there should not be any kind of value judgment here about whether, there's no question about whether this is a better picture than this. This has no empty surface. This has a ton of empty surface. And both of these would be surface-first picture organizations. This would not be a surface-first picture organization because it does not pay attention to whether there's empty surface or not. It just somehow tries to capture whatever is in the depicted scene. But I also wanted to emphasize that even that is not a value judgment. So it's not the case that surface first is supposed to be good pictures and scene first are not good pictures. Tarkovsky does not go in for surface first, and they are pretty good pictures if you ask me, or Marguerite Duras. So what you get from all this is some kind of a multi-dimensional feature space when you can, for any kind of artwork, you can place that in these dimensions about occlusion, no occlusion, empty space, no empty space, perceptual constancies, and see where they fall. And what is especially interesting is that if you look at a part of the world, part of history, and see where pictures that were made at that, in Peru in the 16th century, how they stand. They either cluster around a certain specific point, for example, on the occlusion, no occlusion spectrum, in which case we have reason to think that that's a surface-first picture organization. They really pay attention to where the occlusion is, or it doesn't, or it does not cluster, it just goes all over the place, in which case we have reason to think that the picture makers were not paying attention to the occlusion spectrum, which is a mark of the scene-first picture organization. So without knowing anything about what these people were interested in, what kind of religious subjects they were depicting, for what purposes, what kind of ceremonies they had, what were the function of these paintings, we can draw some kind of conclusions about the picture organization that they were using. And that is going to be aesthetically significant in all cultures. It is there in all cultures. So this is the kind of non-Western inspired cultural but universally applicable feature space that we can place any kind of picture, no matter where they were made, no matter when they were made, and have some kind of information about them. But again, I should emphasize that that's going to be just the starting point. It's not going to be the full story about the painting. There's a lot of other things about the painting that's going to be very important and significant. Didn't talk about color. That can be very important and significant. Didn't talk about, what it is that it has some kind of ceremonial use or religious use or other kinds of societal use, and so on. But nonetheless, it could give you some information about the pictures, even if you lack any kind of background, any kind of knowledge about the cultural background. And that can somehow bootstrap how things are. Let me give you just a very quick example which is deliberately a Western example. That's about the Annunciation pictures. So where you have Mary and the Archangel, right? And they tend to be very far away from each other normally, and they're never in the same space. And if you look at a lot of them, this might be something that you figure out, that they seem to be either far away or there's some kind of a visually important feature in the middle. And you might ask why that is. And we know that the reason for that is that they're, parts of different domains. Mary is a human, the angel is an angel. So they can't really be, hanging out and giving each other hugs. But you can get some kind of information about this, even if you have no idea about, what this creature is and what that creature is. So that's what I mean, that it's not the end of this, not the full story, but it can be a very significant first step. All right, and the last thing I want to say about how we can do this in a kind of a big data way, and how we can do this in a way that is going to give us some really interesting results. So we can, what I was doing is to give you just a couple of examples to drive home these differences between different ways of doing picture organization. They were very much handpicked. I was picking examples that were kind of really drive home the point that some pictures, they really go in for occlusion, some pictures, they really avoid occlusion. But in order for this to make some kind of statistical sense, you would need a lot of information. And we can do this by now because we're in the age of big data, and we have a ton of pictures digitalized. And we can feed them into this thing called Segment Anything, which is made by the same company as your favorite social media platform. And you can figure out where these pictures are. They can, in terms of this non-Western inspired feature space that I've been talking about. So Wölfflin famously had this project of comparing 16th century and 17th century paintings and pointing out these differences that are somewhat similar to the ones that I was talking about. I don't really want to talk about Wölfflin, musicologist. So, but what he was doing is to use just a couple of pictures and try to somehow come up with these regularities on the basis of that. What we can do now is to have literally thousands and 10,000s of pictures from each of those traditions, each of those centuries, and see some kind of statistical regularities between them. So I want to give you just two case studies about occlusion and empty space, about how that could work with the Segment Anything model. So the Segment Anything model works that you feed in the picture, and then it segments it into various segments. And then on the basis of that, you can you can draw some kind of conclusions about the surface first versus scene first picture organization. So this, I talked about the importance of empty surface here. This is clearly a picture that really overemphasizes the empty picture, and you can have a very simple algorithm whereby you figure out what's the largest and the second largest segments and how much of a percentage of the whole surface it takes up. So that gives a very good and very simple way of coming up with an empty surface value for any picture, no matter where they were made. And you can feed in a lot of pictures from, let's say, 15th century Italy, and that's going to come up with some kind of an empty surface value, which is going to be probably a very low empty surface. And you can feed in, modernist films from the 60s. That's going to come with a much higher empty surface value, and so on. And you can do this for automatically for a very large number of pictures. And so this would be the 15th century painting, which is a very little there is of empty pictures, of empty surface. And you can also do the similar thing with occlusion. It's a tiny bit more complicated, and the thing there is about coming up with how many other segments are neighboring on each of the segments. So what's the average neighboring segment value? That's going to give you a very good approximation of how much how important occlusion is, but you can also play that. So and you can do this, it's a little bit more complicated with perceptual constancies, but the point is that with this, you can really trace the cross-cultural differences between two different cultural productions when it comes to picture organization, and you can do this not on the basis of just a couple of dozens of examples that are going to be by definition cherry-picked, but on the basis of just a large number of paintings. And again, what the result is going to be this kind of non-Western conceptual framework that's applicable to all cultures. So, I talked a lot about pictures, which I feel very bad about, but I felt that I had to tell you this because what I'm looking for is what would be the equivalent in the case of music. So how would that be? What would be the equivalent? First of all, what would be the equivalent of this kind of feature space in the case of music? That would be not inspired by the Western music, but it would nonetheless be applicable to all kinds of musical traditions. Which, in order to do that, we would need to know what kind of features are aesthetically significant in all musical traditions and what are not. Some are clearly going to be aesthetically significant in some cultures, but not in others. Are there any features that are going to be aesthetically significant in all cultures? And then, so the question is whether we can come up with what would be the equivalent of the picture organization in the case of pictures. That is some kind of an umbrella category that has a lot of kind of low-level formal features, but that's still kind of very clearly something that all picture makers have to make a decision. You either go this way or you go that way. Do we have an equivalent in the case of music where you have some kind of a musical feature, then you have to decide. You go this way or you go that way. There's no third option. There's no way of not deciding. There's no way of kind of leaving that question open. And then the question is how you can. Maybe that would be maybe the equivalent of picture organization would be something like musical organization, but what would that be? And also that clearly, the same way as picture organization is not the whole story. There's lots of other things that matters for us about pictures that have nothing to do with picture organization. In the same way, I'm sure that whatever cultural universals we can come up with, whatever universal feature space we come up with in music, that's also going to leave out a lot of things. What would they be that we leave out? And then but if we manage to pull that off in the case of music, then I think that the payoff would be really very significant, and that would be some kind of a conceptual framework that we can apply in any kind of musical work, from Chinese classical opera to Mozart to death metal. So, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bence, for a wonderfully stimulating talk. Now, we have time for questions. My first questions might be how many volumes is this going to be? But no, I'm not going to ask that question. I have other questions, but actually, we have one from YouTube, Rainer Polak, who's been asking a question, or certainly there are two comments here, if that's okay. So I'll start with him and then turn to the floor. So, in music research, it is controversial whether the term music per se is universally valid, for example, in terms of the usually assumed primacy of listening, auditory cognition, or the distinction from dance, ritual, play, etc. Ethnomusicologists and evolutionary music psychologists sometimes tend to disagree here. You have outlined possible parameters or dimensions to talk about pictorial art in general, but what about art and aesthetics per se? Do you think we should also discuss whether and how these generic terms are applicable or not?
Oh, this is a big, huge question. I try to be minimalist here, so in the case of, and I'm fully aware that it's controversial whether music is universally applicable, and what I take to be the analogy in the case of pictures is that, yeah, some cultures, they make pictures in the sense that they put oil on canvas or tempera on wood, but all cultures do pictures in some ways in the sense that they have two-dimensional depictions of three-dimensional scenes. And when I was talking about pictures, I was very deliberately using this much wider definition, or much wider way of thinking about pictures. And if we do this for music, I guess we would, again, need to look for some form of understanding music or music-like phenomenon or something like that, that's equally wide, that has this kind of universal applicability, whether or not we would want to really call it, strictly speaking, music. About how wide I want to go, so I think it's a good idea to go domain by domain. I don't think that that's a very helpful or fun debate about whether art is universal. So there's been a big debate about this, whether art, as we understand it in the West, whether that exists in all cultures. And then you can say yes, you can say no, it really depends on all kinds of things. I don't think that's a very helpful way of thinking about it. When I talked about pictures, they didn't have to be art, right? Not all pictures are art. Most pictures are not art at all. Many of the pictures that I showed you, they were not made for artistic purposes. So anything is going to count as a picture when it's a two-dimensional depiction of a three-dimensional scene. It could be a magazine ad, it could be a exit sign, it could be a all kinds of other exit sign right there. It could be anything as long as it's a two-dimensional depiction of a three-dimensional object. Again, I think what we should look for is something similar for music that does not have the kind of highbrow art connotations.
Thank you. Alexander has a question.
Thank you. This was very interesting. I'll leave the music discussion for later. I have more question about pictures and to start with. I was wondering about, given that we are at RITMO and interested in rhythm, I wanted to ask you about your opinion on rhythm in this thing, visual rhythm and the temporality of things. You talked about the temporal thickness. You also talked about occlusion, where it's a lot about patterns or even textures, I guess, in what I see at least. And then I'm very quickly drawn to think about these as a kind of rhythmic elements, and then with or without time. So I just wanted to ask you if you have been considering this element in your thinking.
So I almost added some slides on visual rhythm, and maybe I have some pictures that are visual rhythm-y. So maybe this. Yeah, no, I don't really have a very good illustration. So visual rhythm, I think, is a surface-first feature. So visual rhythm would be, when you have certain features of certain aesthetically significant features in a kind of a rhythmical way, but not distributed in time, but distributed in space. I think that that's very difficult to think of that in any other way than surface-first, picture organization way. Because what's happening is that the way you're organizing the surface is by kind of delineating with kind of relatively regular patterns. And maybe this is not a bad illustration for that. Oh, you can see, I think that's fine. So I was thinking that might be a good kind of connection between the music thing, but then I was thinking that really what I'm interested is this, how you can apply the general framework to music, so I didn't want to somehow mix in the visual rhythm. I think visual rhythm is a topic that a lot more would need to be said about this. There's very little research on visual rhythm, whereas as you guys know, working at RITMO, there's a lot of work on musical rhythm, so that's an interesting crossover, but something that is crying out to be studied.
Hello, very interesting talk. My reaction to it, however, is very negative, so I'll try to present this in a way that is constructive, and you take of it what you will. In trying to generalize a strategy from looking at visual art to looking at music, I'm very concerned about your insistence on dropping the social context. I think we can argue about what might be older in terms of a cultural practice, music-like practices, pictorial depiction-like practices culturally, but the ability of music to be fixed and shared without musicians and outside of an active social context is relatively new relative to that capacity for visual art. And that means that there's a lot of principles around what music is in case by case that has a lot to do with the specific social context in which it was created and received. And to not let that be part of any kind of systematic exploration of what music can be feels like a very elite Western view of music where we have rarefied so much music to be on a stage in front of a passive audience when we know that there's so many other, particularly if you're open to sort of wider considerations of cultural objects to inspect than just the most elite forms of it. Most music isn't shared and experienced in that kind of rarefied, separate, static kind of presentation. And so to ignore the social context is a very, sounds foolhardy from the perspective of thinking of music as an active thing that we engage in. And this was, I was struggling with this as you were presenting these sort of factors that shape our experience of music, because while we are also different in the way in which we appreciate individual works, we're also very different in how we appreciate specific instances of the same work. In terms of, as a musician, if I'm playing a piece of music, that's very different from when I'm listening to it, or as a dancer, when I'm dancing to it. And obviously, all of those relationships will change the overall aesthetic experience in a way that is, I wouldn't say that visual art doesn't have a range and flexibility there, but the amount of flexibility that is part of our construction of the experience of music is already gigantic in a known way. So I'm concerned about how you might find ways of including the social, maybe not thinking of it as the full historical social context of the work's origins and initial reception. There might be other ways of getting into that. But it's, I think, very difficult to think of music without all of those other pieces. So.
Great. I actually really quite agree with all of this. The first thing I want to say is that I don't think there's a huge asymmetry with the visual arts. I think that we have good reasons to think that much of visual art was really created in a way that was not for, detached observation by a individually isolated observer. In fact, I have a piece where I argue that the way we think of, like, the way aestheticians think of aesthetic appreciation of, like, a person alone observing an object, regardless of some kind of the context, is completely unique for Western aesthetics, and no other aesthetic traditions in the world, let alone historically much older ways of what we know about aesthetic practices about the past. No other aesthetic traditions in the world are kind of sharing any of those assumptions about the solitariness of the observation, about the fact that the object we're observing is an object, is an actual thing rather than a process. So there's a lot to say about that. But again, I don't think that there's a big discrepancy between the two things. I think that there's an issue for visual art as well. Visual art was also, much of visual art was also created for social purposes or social context. Now, how should we go about finding out? Then that's the question. And I'm not, you're saying ignoring the social context. I'm not, at no point was I trying to ignore the social context. The general strategy I have is to try to have a starting point for exploring an artwork that is independent of the social context as a first step that needs to be supplemented with context-sensitive second step. But unless we go in for a social context-independent first step, then we have no way of overcoming this methodological asymmetry that follows from the epistemic asymmetry. Again, let's suppose that we're trying to find out what was the kind of musical engagement of the Maya. We just have zero information on that. Archaeological acoustics gives you very little information. It gives you something. So what you can do is to, on the basis of archaeological acoustics, come up with certain formal features that you can then compare with other formal features in other kind of tradition, and look for irregularities in those formal features, and figure out on the basis of that, and that could be like a first step, that was not going to privilege the West to the Western music, to the Mayan music, because we have the exact same information about the formal features. And then, once you have that, you can supplement, you can plug in what kind of information you have about the social context. So it's not about, giving a social context, like ignoring the social context. It's about where you start. If you start with a social context, you're never gonna move past this asymmetry, because there's just a ton of information about social context in one case, very little information about social context in the other case. If you start with a kind of social context independent thing, then at least you're on equal footing at the beginning. Then, of course, when you plug in more and more information about the social context, that it's going to enrich that. So the way I think about it is that you have to kind of move between the social context independent and the social context dependent way of thinking about the objects. You have to somehow do more of this, and then on the basis of that, you do more of that. This kind of bootstrapping one after the other. But what I feel kind of strongly about is that you have to start with the social context independent thing. So you're starting with formal features that you can come up with on the basis of this feature space analysis that I was talking about. On the basis of those formal features, you can add on social context dependent features. On the basis of that, you can discover more social features, sort of more formal features. On the basis of that, you can have more social context dependent feature, and you can build this up like this. If you start this kind of building up with information with social context, you're always going to kind of be stuck in that asymmetry. So I'm really worried about that. And so that's the general shape of my response. You don't seem very happy.
Thank you. Speaking of the social context, one thing I think is courageous to try to save aesthetics as a concept, because at least to my generation, there was so much weird stuff going on. And in particular, we had Adorno in the 70s, and I think the ethnocentricity of it is beyond salvage. I mean, it's very problematic. So, on the other hand, we have in music, in case you're not aware of this, the psychophysical project actually started in the 19th century, Helmholtz. So the idea was to have this kind of perception-based aesthetics for good and bad, which has been much further developed in the 20th century, and now more recently, as you pointed out, with big data, we have actually the possibility of doing research on huge collections of what's assumed to be musical sounds, and putting in queries that are based on subjectively experienced features. So I think all in all, that is a promising way to go. But at the end of the day, it's the conceptual challenges that remain. How to define these different features. For instance, percussivity. How would you define percussivity in music? It's pretty much a universal kind of feature, but with very much local implementation, so to speak. I think we have a bright future, but again, returning to the broken aesthetic concepts, I'm personally quite skeptical whether it can be saved.
Aesthetics,
yes,
as a discipline.
Yes.
Right. Well, a lot of aestheticians are going to be sad to hear that. But I mean, I think that the question is whether you can really move past on assumptions in aesthetics that are just clearly wrong. I mean, I think aesthetics, if you think of aesthetics as a discipline that is trying to understand certain experiences of the kind that are really important for us, that is not. We can do that without making any kind of Adornoian assumptions about the primacy of various ethno concepts. So I feel aesthetics is an important discipline to salvage, so we should do whatever we can to do that. And part of this project is about how many ways in which you can do aesthetics is going to really kind of keep us rooted in this kind of West-centered way, which is I don't think is really feasible. So we have to find another way, and I think that that's a big challenge. But it's also, I think, if we, as a result, we can talk about aesthetic phenomena in a way that's not West-centric, then it's also a big payoff. So I think it's worth doing. Yeah, and I'd love to hear more about the ongoing stuff on big data, with the help of big data on musical features.
Okay, thank you so much. Many interesting ideas. I kind of want to follow up on Finn's comment, because you have been asked about aesthetics, but what about the term global? What does that mean in this context? That's my first question. And the second one is, because it's a fascinating idea to try to find those features that we can use to describe all kind of art or pictures or music in the world. But where is that neutral position? How can you escape your own social context and your own learning and your own biases in such a process?
Good. So I take this to be really the same question, right? When you ask me about global and you ask me about whether it's
because it's
biased.
global. It seems that at some point you kind of use global as similar to non-Western. But I mean, Beethoven is also global in one sense.
Exactly. So global is supposed to be, global is not supposed to be non-Western. Global is supposed to be everything that's been happening on this planet, right? Any kind of aesthetic production that's been happening on this planet. And the general idea is to not restrict it to any kind of specific tradition. But I do think that what you're saying in the second question is a challenge, and that's something that I've been very aware of. So maybe a way of putting it is that, all right, so I came up with this allegedly non-Western inspired concepts like occlusion versus no occlusion, or empty space versus non-empty space. Are they really non-Western inspired? So you might think that, these are very much inspired by classic Western formalism, right? No one who's, people who grew up in Southeast Tanzania, when they study patterns of waving, they're not going to come up with occlusion, and these are deeply rooted in formalist concepts. So that's a worry. But the way I'm trying to address this worry is that these are, regardless of whether whether I know about these things from reading Wölflin or where else. This is something that no matter where you're making a picture, you have to make a decision. And I've done some research in digging myself into various local aesthetics, so Yoruba aesthetics and Japanese aesthetics and various Islamic aesthetics, that they all seem to have some kind of equivalent concept, for example, for occlusion or the avoidance of occlusion. So this is something that I'm trying to actively pay attention to, that these concepts, whenever I use them, they must be concepts that they have some kind of equivalent in a wide variety of aesthetic traditions, not just in the Western one. So, but the main point is that if you're trying to depict this scene, you need to make a decision about whether you're going to pay attention to one face of the people in the crowd, not occluding another face in the crowd, or not. These are the two options that you have. And this is something that's going to be an important aesthetic choice regardless of what tradition you're in. And again, I want to pay attention to all the aesthetic traditions that we know about, or that we have some kind of information about, to see that it's rooted in all of them and not just in Western aesthetics.
I put myself on the list, if that's okay. So I'm finding it really interesting. You've really opened up for a bit of sort of help or input with the book, and all we're doing is creating more challenges, so which might be helpful, I guess, for the final product. But I'll put myself in the queue here. What we have currently going is, of course, a discussion of the value of different kinds of epistemic paradigms, And I'm not forgetting that you're coming from the analytic tradition of philosophy. So the discussion of aesthetics is already a bit, has been breaking out in a way, It wasn't until it's very recent that aesthetics had a sort of real place, and also thanks to you, in the philosophical discussions within the analytic tradition, right? Aesthetics was seen as not a discipline or a philosophical discipline at all. Back in the 1960s, I believe, actually, there was an article on exactly that point. So you are salvaging, to some extent, aesthetics from a particular tradition, or you're adding to that. When it comes to looking at then the value of the argument that you're proposing, that made me think of, because I think it's a wonderful argument, but I can understand the challenges inherent, and also when we're talking about the complex art form that is music. But I was reminded of, I don't know if you've read the beginning of Roger Scruton, or you've read the book Beauty, and then the beginning of that book, Roger Scruton is very careful to say, I'm making a philosophical argument. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an historian, I'm making a philosophical argument about beauty. So there's something, it reminded me of that, although I think that's probably much more black and white rather than, compared to what you would say. But I don't think we should forget that you are making a philosophical argument and that this argument is important. Okay, so here comes then back to language, if I may.
Can I just address this question?
Yeah.
So I'm not a fan of Scruton for many reasons. I know the guy too well, I guess. He's dead now, but he's not a good human being. But what I'm trying to do is not to give. I'm trying to do the opposite. I mean, I think that these are incredibly complex issues. We're looking at the same objects. You grew up in Indonesia. I grew up in Europe. How are they different? I think that for these incredibly complex questions, what we have to do is to just throw anything we have at them. Not just philosophy, because philosophy, frankly, I mean, I don't think that philosophy can really do much. But anything that we have, the empirical sciences of the mind, so neuroscience, psychology, various empirical studies of the arts, musicology, art history, sociology. So I feel that we have to combine all of these things in order to come up with an answer. So I would be very against doing only philosophy because I'm not sure that philosophy can achieve too much.
Yeah, thank you. Great. When it comes to your focus on attention and mental imagery, right, throughout, I began quite early on wondering what you might think musical mental imagery looks like, right? So when we talk about the imagination, it's, often quite visual centered. So what is an oral imagination? And so there's a challenge with the language used, right? So perception tends to sort of include grasping, understanding, seeing, whereas musicologists and other parts of philosophy, I guess, would be quite happy to talk about not just perception, but experience as something that captures musical engagement, or even sensing. So by talking about perception and attention and mental imagery, it's a challenge to see where music fits in a way. But maybe you can I'd love to hear your thoughts on what an oral imagination might be.
Sure, great. So I think some of this is a terminological issue. So the way I think about perception is that experience, perceptual experience is a subcategory of perception. So perception can be conscious or unconscious. If it's conscious, we call it perceptual experience. But there's also a lot of reason to think that perception also can be unconscious. Sensing, I also feel that sensing is, the way I use the term sensing is a sensory input coming in, and perception is the processing of the sensory input. You create a perceptual representation on the basis of the input, and that's perceptual processing. So I think some of it is just terminology. So I think that when I talk about the perception of music, I think that encompasses everything that you were just talking about: experience, sensing, perception. And I also feel that the imagery thing is also partly about terminology. So the way I use the term mental imagery is the way the empirical scientists use the term mental imagery, and it's basically a form of perceptual representation that's not directly triggered by the input. It does not have to be an image. So when you have earworms, you're all familiar with earworms, that's auditory mental imagery. It's an auditory perceptual representation that's not directly triggered by auditory input. You're not hearing, it's a silent room, but you keep hearing, I don't know, lambada or whatever, that you really don't want to. So how do you say earworm in Norwegian? Or in Danish?
Say earworm. Ørehænger. No, in Danish we say ørehænger, something you can't get rid of. Yeah, it's manual.
So it's important that, so again, mental imagery is perceptual representation that's not directly triggered by sensory input. That's not the same as imagination. So mental imagery is used very different to imagination. Imagination is a mental action, it's something you do. And there's a lot of discussion about different forms of imagination, propositional imagination, sensory imagination. Mental imagery is a technical concept that, was introduced at the dawn of experimental psychology at the end of the 19th century. And that is really just supposed to be it's very simply offline perception. Perception, when you use the perceptual system in the same way as you would use it when you have input, but you just don't have input. So when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, that would be mental imagery. But also when you when you try to recreate the beginning of Monteverdi's Orfeo in your mind's ear, that's also mental imagery, that's auditory mental imagery. You have auditory mental processing, auditory mental representations, and even often auditory experiences that's clearly not triggered by the input, because you're not hearing anything, you're in a room completely without any music, right? So, and that's when I think that auditory mental imagery is incredibly important when we're understanding music. I was briefly considering giving a talk about auditory mental imagery, but I just finished the mental imagery book, so I thought that I'm not going to do that. Because when we're listening to music, we're constantly kind of updating our mental imagery, temporal mental imagery of the auditory kind of what's coming next. When we're listening to a piece that we know, that's very salient, so you have the kind of auditory mental imagery of the next note. But even if you don't know the piece, it's the first time you heard it, you have some kind of an auditory imagery, auditory expectation, which in this case are very similar, it's going to end up being very similar, of how the tune is going to continue.
Great, thank you. Bruno, this question?
Yeah, a very short question. In the beginning, I think you were making the connection between cultural variations and the use of attention and mental imagery. Is that correct? Could you elaborate on that? Are you envisioning the possibility that some of the cultural variation is due simply by attending or imaging things that belong to the culture? Is that people from different cultures have different semantic fields, they refer to different knowledge? Or do you think that the mechanisms themselves could be differing? And so how deep do you want to go?
Yeah, good. I don't want to go that deep. So I think that the primary visual cortex of me and someone who grew up in Southeast Tanzania is exactly the same. They work in the same way. So there's going to be some kind of, it can be universal about that. But given that much of the processing of the visual system is going to be very sensitive to various higher level representations about things we know, about things we believe, and also about things we have seen before, again, the way we attend to things and what we're going to attend, so if you have some kind of a visual display, what is it that we're going to attend to or how we're going to attend to is going to be very different. The actual mechanisms of attention are going to be the same, but what we're attending to and how we're going to attend to are going to be different. And in case of mental imagery, the way the visual cortices generate some kind of representation without an input is going to be the same, regardless of where you are. But depending on what kind of stored memory you're going to use to, for example, fill in the details of the horse that you're forming a mental imagery, that's still gonna give you a very different kind of mental imagery, very different kind of, and as a result, a very different kind of experience. So again, I don't want to deny that there's some kind of similarity, some kind of universality in how the primary visual cortices work, for example.
Okay, I'm going to give the final question to one of our RITMO researchers on YouTube, Olivier Latilot. It's a longer question, so bear with me. So I guess it was in connection with when we talked about structures, sort of the search for structures earlier, if you like. And he says, this reminds me of neutral level analysis expressed by Jean-Jacques Nattier in his music semiotics, and the hypothesis of the existence of immanent structure in the music. For instance, in Beethoven, ta-ta-ta-ta example, we could suppose it is obvious that we have 4-note motifs repeated and transposed, but this idea of immanent structure collapses when considering, for instance, how to automate such structure discovery with machines. You have to define heuristics based, for instance, on music psychology and cognition. The immanence of structure becomes then just an illusion. Would it mean that there is no universal way to describe music?
What was the last sentence?
Would it mean that there's no universal way to describe music?
Well, in some ways, that's my big question, right? Can we find a universal way of describing music? And I mean, if my analogy with picture perception or picture composition or picture organization is really valid, then it's not going to be a very straightforward thing to look for. There's not going to be any features that are just kind of we could read off, but you have to somehow actively look for features that are going to be aesthetically significant in all cultures. And I really if you have any further thoughts, I would love to see some references, and I'm sure that there are people are publishing articles about this that I'm not aware of, so please help me.
We shall take this question down to the coffee and talk a bit more about temporality as well, I think, because that's a very defining feature of music.
Sounds great.
Okay, thank you so much, Bence.
Thank you.